Welcome to the Treachery of Data podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. So this one is going to be pretty good because we had quite a spirited discussion around this. And the main topic is when to decide on what metrics to track for activities that you're doing. Like if you're running tests, doing research, like how do you and when do you decide on what metrics you're going to assign up importance to? And this all came about because of a LinkedIn post from Nils Koppelman, which we will, of course, link in the episode description and notes and all of that. And we had what I think like 6 different people contributing to this conversation at the roundtable, including me, you, Nils himself, the Shiva Manjunath, Slobodan Manik, and Craig Sullivan. So quite a few, good contributors there into the conversation.
Yeah,
you can't
definitely.
just nod silently on a
you
audio
can't just nod.
podcast.
Does your transcription not pick that up? Well, what's going on? Yeah, it was a really good discussion. It was kind of wide-ranging discussion. It was much more wide-ranging than I thought it would be, actually.
Yeah.
But to kick straight things right into it, I mean, the first thing I think we got to sort of elaborate on is what are the common problems with setting metrics? So why is this such a big discussion, important discussion, and why was it so spirited? And I don't think we can do that without addressing the importance of the of metrics and the importance of, or rather, the problems arising from not setting the right metrics and not setting them at the right time.
And one of the ways that I think about it is metrics need to sit in sort of a Goldilocks zone, meaning you can't have too few, but you also can't have too many, right? You have to have an appropriate balance. Like too few leads to spaghetti testing, which we kind of covered that last week, or not last week on our previous episode as well. We've been on a metrics kick lately. Spaghetti testing, meaning you're just doing whatever and just throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks. You don't have any kind of like direction or purpose to your testing. You're just kind of like doing it for the sake of doing it because that's your job, or whatever, right? You're sort of like directionless, rudderless. Then on the other side of like having too many metrics, that leads to decision paralysis. Like you're trying to like dig into and like you're over analyzing and paralyzed by like, oh, I need to like, what about this? What about that? What about this other thing? You're trying like too many cooks in the kitchen, to use another strained cooking analogy there.
Yeah, and I think in terms of like, there's a couple of things here, because I think we're going to continue our metrics kick, and we're going to discuss that thing that you just mentioned, which is super important. When how many metrics should you be tracking? Because I think that's a really wide-ranging discussion in itself. I think that additionally to that, one of the key things in terms of you see common problems, yes, that is a really big one. Another big one is that picking the wrong metrics. So and that kind of leads to tests not being significant, and that kind of leads to experiment results where you don't actually learn anything. Because if you have experiment results where you don't learn anything, it could be an issue with the metrics that you're tracking, and maybe you're not tracking. Maybe there is an impact, but you just weren't tracking that metric. So in that for a sort of instance, I think it's an important sort of component or an important problem, and it's a key problem to address when or a key fact to a figure to address when we're looking at when do we set these metrics.
What would be a good example of the wrong metrics to track? Because this is not like a hard and fast question of like, oh, that's the wrong metric and you should never track it. Like, as with most things, there's going to be contextual relevance. Like, this is the right metric to track for this test, but that same metric, like let's use a practical example of, like, say, add to cart rate, right? Like, okay, add to cart rate is important for this experiment, but it's not important for this other experiment. So yeah, so what's an example of like the wrong metric to track?
So I'll give you a real key, for instance, because usually, and this goes back to the Trainline days as well, when you're supporting product managers, and especially if you're a developer running the test and you're in these meetings where you're trying to figure out, like, what have we learned from this experiment? You're analyzing a whole bunch of tests, for instance. If say during that meeting somebody says, oh, this test, what did we learn? Maybe it was a loss because of this, and then somebody goes, well, maybe, but we didn't track anything around that, so we don't know. Or was it a win because of this? Maybe, but we didn't track anything around that metric, so we don't know. So I think it's kind of like very, very wide. And yes, the add to basket is a really key one, because
Do you have like an actual historical example where like that was a mistake that maybe like you made, or you're perfect and you've never made any mistakes, so maybe you have a hypothetical?
Yes. So a friend of mine made this mistake, and I won't mention him because I don't want to put him in a bad spot.
Well, you've already assigned gender, so
yeah. But okay, so basically going back to your add to basket one. So say with the add to basket, and say there was a change made to the selection, add product to basket or something like that. And say in that instance, in that design for the variant, what it introduced is a little bit more complexity, and that complexity is far greater when there's other elements present on the page. So say, for instance, when there's 10 product items on the list, rather than a single product item on the list, and then you've got to change to an add to cart button, so making it really prominent, for instance. And then when you have 10 items on the list, maybe it's too prominent because there's like 10 add to cart buttons really screaming out at you from the page. So from that instance, then the question might be, well, was it because people were just overcome by the sheer sort of complexity of the page, and we were just slapped around the face with all of these add to cart buttons, and they didn't know what to do, what to pick, and the common choice overload sort of
it's not really a choice overload. It's more of like
it's not choice overload,
focus, right?
Lack of focus, and just like unclear information hierarchy as a result of too many things on the page. There you go. That's the perfect way to do it. So in that case, how do you the way you would measure that is if you had a metric to say how many product items were on display when they were clicked. So if the number of clicks reduced overall by making this button more prominent, how in what circumstances did it do that? And that is a key instance of where a metric was missing from the development of that test, because what should have happened is that you should have designed the test with that in mind, and then you should have gone, okay, we need to be able to track these instances because these are the confounding variables. And this, again, we're going back to something we mentioned in the other podcast. When there are confounding variables, have we captured as many of those confounding variables as we can, and all of the independent variables as we can from that test?
Yeah, and I'll give you an like a recent example of a mistake that I made, and this was a very simple, straightforward test. We were testing
You made, or a friend of yours made?
No, I made it. I'll admit to making. I mean, I was able to salvage it, and I'll explain through the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is something that I did.
Okay.
We're running a test where there was a basically like upsell product carousel immediately underneath the add to cart button, and it was small, like it was a fashion site. So it was like, if you're buying a, say, like a shirt, then in the recommendation list would be like, oh, here's a matching pair of pants, and here's a matching pair of socks, and here's like a jacket or whatever, right? So you could quickly find like additional items to like do like a complete the look kind of upsell feature, right? And we basically just wanted to test the efficacy of that recommender carousel. So it was a very straightforward show hide test of like, what's the performance like when that upsell carousel is present, and what's the performance like when it's hidden, you know? And we ran the test and discovered like, oh, like a lot of users click on that carousel. It was like it had like a 15-16% click-through rate, so really high click-through rate, but add to cart rate and order conversion rate weren't being lifted at all. So really all that carousel was doing was just shifting which product users would ultimately purchase. Like they weren't purchasing in any like AOV wasn't lifted or anything like that. Now, one thing that or overlooked or forgot to set up is that there's also other recommender lists on those product pages. So there's like product alternatives and like a recently viewed and stuff in like lower down on the page in a different area, right? I didn't track engagement on those because I didn't think of it at the time, but it's like, okay, did the behavior shift from like using the upsell recommender to the alternative recommenders instead? Now, fortunately, I was able to salvage it as a backup because we feed test data into heat mapping and replay tools. So I was able to just basically like use heat maps to see like what was the engagement rate of those sections as a backup. But that was an example. That's an example where it's like, oh, I totally missed and overlooked a metric for the test.
And that's the metric that you missed is a very specific metric specific to the experiment.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's probably a good idea at this point to define the different types of metrics that you could categorize metrics as.
Yeah.
That's something that we discussed
Yep.
at the roundtable, and I think there was a broad range of agreement in the categorization of the metrics.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of discussion around the name of one of the metrics, but one of the categories. But anyway,
Yeah, there's back and forth on naming, but I mean, it's more, like the conceptual understanding of like this type of metric.
Yeah, so we've got
So there's
primary, guardrail, and secondary metric, right?
right, yeah. So primary, and this is what we discussed in the previous episode of like the one or two metrics of importance that you will ultimately be using to make a decision.
Yep.
On
For that specific
for
experiment.
that specific experiment, right? The primary metric for one test might not be the primary metric for another test. And like I said, the way that I do it, I have like a primary user behavior metric and a primary business behavior metric. User behavior metric is more often experiment specific because it's directly tied to the change that you're making. Business metric, a lot of times that carries over from experiment to experiment because that's sort of, some people call it like North Star metric or something like that, right? It's the business benefit that you're trying to like push on consistently. Then guardrail metrics are things that are going to be usually related in some way to the primary metric, but that you're tracking to because you want to make sure that you're not adversely affecting
So
them.
these are generally going to be your business critical metrics. So even if they're not related to the primary metric, you just want to have them there because you don't want it to adversely affect those metrics. So for instance, your conversion rate metric is always going to be there. It might be a primary metric or it might be a guardrail. Revenue.
On any e-com site, there's a trio of goals of like order conversion, revenue, and number of products purchased.
But the interesting metric and this is the one that that drove a lot of discussion, is this other metric, the secondary metrics or behavioral
the
metrics,
third
or
classification.
the third classification. And what we discussed is, we started off by saying, are they supporting metrics? But really, that kind of leads to you thinking that they're supporting the primary metric or supporting the decision metric. So
Which
basically,
isn't
that may not
necessarily
is
true.
not necessarily the case. So maybe the
Some of them
terminology
can
might be
be,
wrong.
like, some of them can be supporting, but
Yeah.
then sometimes some of them are also, like, I think of them almost as like investigative. Like, it's not something that you're primarily concerned with, but you want to see how this is affecting that, because maybe that's a new avenue of exploration that you want to dig into further down the line or something like that.
Yeah. And it's really this metric that we're saying that we need to is going to be very, very test specific. So
Mhm.
primary and guardrails are mostly going to be set early on, but the secondary metric, that is going to be often very specific to the experiment that you're running.
Yeah.
So then it's like,
So I also want to touch on, so you're saying like experiment specific.
yeah,
This is another classification method that I utilize for experiment or for goals as well, is something being, I call them broad and specific, and it's really within the context of the experiment. So broad means like, this is a goal, this is a metric that is generally reusable across experiments. Like, you use it all the time. And usually those are more related to business metrics of importance. And then specific goals or metrics are things that are specific to the change that you're making for the experiment. So
yeah,
if you're making a change to the call to action area on the product page, your specific goals might be like clicks on, attribute selections. Like, does that affect how users make selections for like size, color, things like that? Or is it increasing or decreasing like the click through on the review stars? Like, if the review stars are clickable or something like that. Like, in engagement metrics within the space that you're affecting in the experiment.
which then leads us to, like, when is the right time to decide on those metrics. And if we go back to the LinkedIn post, there was a lot of discussion there on that LinkedIn post, and there was a range of opinions there as well. And I think there was a range of opinions in terms of, some were saying it has to be done at the point at which the idea is conceptualized, then the metric is set. There's a perception that, or a view that the metrics need to be set even before you start the experiment, or ideate on the experiment. Like, to say, if you're running on a problem specific or problem centric sort of approach to testing, then the metrics are set at that level by the business, and then all the experiments are then tracking that. And there's the more nuanced view that I think we're going to be really addressing and getting into, which is, it's really a mixture of both,
It's
and maybe,
gradiated. Yeah.
yeah, and maybe and I would just want to also expand on that point about setting your metrics at the point of the idea is generated, because I think there is some faulty assumptions there, or maybe assumptions that I'm making about what constitutes as an idea. But so let's dig
There's
into that a little.
there's some fuzziness in the terminology there of like, well, what do you define each progress state
Yeah,
as? Um, and there's also an interesting addendum here around, well, is there a point where it's too late to decide on the
yeah.
metrics as
Oh
well?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
that's
That's
something
a
that
good one.
wasn't even really dug into at all.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that goes back to the idea of like broad and specific.
Mm.
Like, broad metrics are going to like your business directional metrics. Like, hey, we need to focus on improving this metric because that is like going to positively affect the business bottom line, and that can be order conversion rate, that can be revenue, that can be leads generated. It all depends on like what is the goal of the business, right? And so that's like what you're working towards. That's defined outside of the scope of any single experiment.
And
And so
that actually,
that's even defined like before you come up with an experiment idea or anything.
yeah, and that is kind of like the so I have a different terminology to that, or a different term that I
Okay.
use for that, but I think it's broadly the same thing, to use your phrase broadly.
What's your term for them then? Yeah, because I have my own internal way of thinking of things. But
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, and this leads into what some were saying on that LinkedIn post, because if you're approaching experimentation from a problem-centric perspective, i.e., the business defines a problem that you're going to be working on, and then there's experimentations that follow that are based around this problem, and the problem should hopefully be researched, etc., etc. Well, at that point, when it's being passed to the teams, this is the problem that you're working with or you're working on, there'll be some metrics defined to know whether or not you're shifting the metrics on that problem. And the problem isn't necessarily always conversion rate. It sometimes is, but it could be something to do with where we think there's some friction in the booking process, or there's people who are getting confused, or there's lack of engagement
there's
and stuff
levels
like
of
that.
granularity within there, depending
Yeah,
on
there's a
like, the
level of
size of your
granularity. Yeah,
organization and like how many
but in
teams are
but in
working on
gen
different stuff.
yeah, but in general, what you would have is that the teams, or in this specific instance, it'd be product teams who have some OKRs set, and those OKRs would be related to those problems that they're trying to solve for that quarter or whatever. So I think that there's some metrics that are set before you even start, and then obviously it's the guardrail metrics are also set, and the only ones that we're really talking about are going to shift slightly is maybe the primary metric and the secondary metric. And then from that perspective, and this goes into the next sort of area that I think I'm having a problem just understanding and picking apart. Basically, there's some people saying that the metrics are set at the idea level, at the point at which an idea is generated. But for me, when working with product teams, etc., you have the idea, and then you might have a hypothesis, and then from that, there's still design yet to come. So the design hasn't been set yet. So there's the idea,
Right.
and the designs work on the idea. So I don't think
I
you
think
can
those are
work
just
on.
progress stages, and you can define additional goals at each step. Like as the design coalesces from goal, idea, discrete hypothesis, like you're adding metrics of importance for each stage of that like workflow.
But should there be a specific point at which, because the way that I always work is there's a specific point at which you define the metrics that you're going to be using for that test. Now, and that specific point, as I say, some metrics already been set, and that specific point is between design and development. Between the point after which you've designed the experiment, this is what we're going to be testing, and this is the UI we're going to be testing. Before it gets sent over to the developers, at that point, there needs to be some decision made on these are the metrics we're going to be tracking for that test. And that would be based on reviewing the design in terms of the independent variables change, the confounding variables
Let's
change.
clarify there. So when you say design, do you mean the conceptual design of the test, like the configuration of the test, or do you mean like the design of the interface?
Both. So
Okay.
there'll be because even at the
So
idea
same
stage, there
thing I
might be
said
some.
earlier of like
Yeah.
stages. Like, okay, you
Yes.
set the goal, then you do the design of this stage, then then you move on to the next stage. You set the goals and do the design.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, at the design stage, there might be when the designers are working on some the UI designs, UI concepts for the variant, it might be decided, you know what, we need an extra variant in there, and in adding that extra variant, that's going to have a
Then you
bearing
regress
in terms of
backwards to a previous stage to see, like, well, okay, is it viable to add another variant from a statistical standpoint? Right. So you're doing process loops and like regressing and progressing at each, just like a QA process, where it's like,
yes,
if it's approved, okay, if you move forward. If it's
yeah, because
rejected,
it's a
you
cycle, it's
go
an
back.
iteration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cycle.
But it's only after this point at which the test has been designed can you decide on what metrics this test needs ultimately, like as a final sign off before it goes to the development team. And I think if to do it at the point at which you come up with a hypothesis, well, at that stage, it's just a concept. It's just an idea, and without something solid to look at the designs, you're not going to know what confounding variables are involved here, who might be impacted, and what are the complete list of independent variables that you're changing for that test. And those are two absolutely critical pieces of information that you need in order to decide what metrics it is that we're going to be tracking for that test.
Okay. So then let's look at the last question there of, is there a point at which it is too late?
Mm.
So my thought there is really the only point at which it's too late is once the test is live, because you don't want to add additional metrics to something that's already running, because that can, affect calculations. And also, like, there'll be a gap of, like, when that, like, say you add a goal after a week, like, okay, I mean, it's still maybe a little bit of a judgment call. Like, what's the degree of importance of that metric? Like, if it's a secondary metric and it's something you want to investigate, okay, it's probably all right to add it, because,
Yeah.
like, adding tracking and reporting isn't going to affect user behavior.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't skew adding a new metric during the test runtime, say a couple of days in, or say a week in, even if that metric, by adding it late, doesn't skew the output of that metric. Say, for instance, you're tracking it in the control group, but you weren't tracking it in the variant, and then now you suddenly added it into the variant. That's not going to fly. So you basically need to stop that test and restart it.
Yeah,
But if
if you're
it's a
running in
common,
like a SRM or something, like, right,
yeah,
like, yeah, if something not tracking on one side of the test, or like that, but that's a configuration issue. Like,
it's
assuming that everything is constructed well.
yeah, and that kind of so I think in terms of, as long as the metric that you're adding
Is
is
not a
reflective,
primary metric. So
and
if it's not a
yeah,
primary or a guardrail, you're okay.
and is a
If it's one of
secondary,
those two, then it's kind of like you need to go back and rethink stuff.
yes, and if it's a secondary, you can add it as long as you've added it and it reflects evenly across the control and the variant, like it's tracking both from that point onwards. So, and I think going back to your point in terms of some you could be adding something for a specific variant and not for the control. I think that's the point you're making. There is kind of like or rather, the point you were making is that it should be the case by default, that it should be the case. But a common problem that I see is that sometimes the type of metrics are added as a secondary metric is not even the right type of metric to be added to a test in the first place. So, for instance, if as by adding that metric, there's no comparison point between the A and the B, well, then what's the point in having that metric there as part of your test? And I think that's probably a separate topic and probably something to dig into a little bit.
Yeah, because I could see potentially disagreeing with that a little bit, but
Mm.
yeah.
But I mean, yes, there are nuances, I think.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But in general, if you add a metric that is specific only to the control or specific only to the variant, that metric is going to be of very limited use, because if you use that metric to
It's
segment,
going to be lopsided. Like say,
yeah,
like you're tracking a metric for like clicks on something that exists on the variant but not in the control.
mhm,
Well, yeah, it doesn't exist on the control, so it's not going to get any clicks. So you're going to be comparing 0 versus a percentage.
yeah,
Now, for like evaluative comparison, that's useless because you have nothing to compare against. If you're trying to just evaluate efficacy of that thing, okay, you're just wanting like engagement rate on the feature that's now present or something to see like maybe you have a threshold of like, if less than 10% of users engage with this feature, then we don't want to explore it further. Then okay, but
yeah, this is where I think we need to
that's
discuss this more, because
yeah,
even at that point, without having a relative base from which to compare the success of something, you don't know what the success of that's going to be, and so
right,
therefore
yeah,
it
yeah,
becomes it's not really, it's an important metric, but it's not really an experiment metric. It's not a test
yeah,
metric,
yeah. If you
because it's
don't
just a
have
general
something that
metric.
you've calculated beforehand as a point,
Yeah,
like a
or
threshold, and you have to have some reasoning. Like I pulled that 10% number out of my head
yeah,
as a hypothetical, but like you would have to have some business reasoning for like saying like this is the threshold that we want to achieve with this metric. You've crunched the numbers and like that's the absolute break even point for that feature to like generate enough income that it's paying for itself
yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah. So for me, it's like a test metric is something that is comparative. You can
Mhm.
compare the two groups or the three groups or whatever, and you can compare the impact as part of that experiment. Anything above that, they're useful metrics, but or they could be useful metrics, but then probably not specifically test specific metrics, or they're not so vital to the actual test. And there might be some nuances there which we can get into in a separate discussion. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think this was a useful. I think I've learned something here. I've learned that
Well,
this room is
we're
hot.
yeah, uh, we're on a mission of enlightenment, one podcast episode at a time.
One podcast at a time.
All right. Well, so if you'd like to join us on our journey to enlightenment and have any questions, feedback, or disagree with something that we said, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face at the CRO Roundtable every Friday. And you can find a link to that at crotalks.com right there on the homepage. There's a little link that says Zoom link for the upcoming weekly roundtable that's scheduled. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can connect with either of us on LinkedIn instead. And thanks for listening. We will catch you next time.